Hi there everyone, my name's Andy and today I'm going to be showing you how to carve a spoon from the log, which is basically, this is a split piece of cherry that I've split yesterday, and we're going to start by squaring out the billet. And what I like to do is axe out the base profile of the spoon, which is essentially the bottom section of the bowl and then the bottom section of the handle. Okay, so now that we've squared off the billet, what I like to do is then cut in what's called the crank, which is the lowest angle of the spoon. Some people use an axe. For today I'm going to use a saw. And once I've sawed out my lowest crank, and then axe down into that section. Okay, now that we've started to develop a little bit more of a shape for the spoon, I'll thin out the top and the bottom a little bit more. And a good practice when you're working with larger material or any bulk material is to work in thirds. So if you take one angle off as you go, rather than trying to take the whole piece off, you'll make your job a lot easier. Okay, now that we have our base profile of the spoon set up, what I am now going to do is draw my center line, start designing the spoon. A lot of people use templates, which is great. I tend to do all of my spoons freehand. It allows me to kind of focus on what the wood strengths are, work with the material that I have. Okay. Now that we've drawn out a design, what I'll do is I'll basically even out all of my edges and cut what's called a relief cut or a stop cut. So these stop cuts, basically the next section that I'm going to be working on is running down towards the bowl, the back end of the bowl. And then by putting these stop cuts in, and you can also do this by an axe, you can axe in a small V, and it basically relieves the pressure when you start pushing the axe down so that it doesn't split through and make your spoon into a much smaller spoon. Once I've done those downward shots, what I like to do then is work back towards the insides of the shoulders, and it's really nice to set the spoon. Sometimes these relief cuts will pop off when you're doing this next part, but that's fine because they've done their job. I will work back down, and I like to sit this right on the corner of the block just to make sure that all of the weight is not going down towards that thin section. So I'll free this cut up a little bit, and then now that I've done my side profiles or plain view, I'm going to work on thinning out that back once more and giving it a final shape. And then once I've worked over this front section of the bowl, I start to work back down into the shoulders. And that's the axe work done. And then we'll move on to the knives. Okay, so now that we've axed out the spoon, basically where we've worked from is we started with a full split piece of cherry log. We squared off the edges into a billet, and then we axed it into what's called a blank. So this is a spoon blank with its full profile in kind of 3 dimensions. We have our lowest point, which is the crank, the lowest angle of the spoon before it comes back up. Quite often, the more utilitarian a spoon is, so a cooking spoon often has less crank than, say, an eating spoon or a pocket spoon, which is much smaller but has much more aggressive a scoop to it. But yeah, so we're going to shift to the knife work now, where I will basically refine the edges of my design, make sure that everything's looking symmetrical, and make sure that everything's square, because it makes it much easier to kind of work my way down once I've squared off my sides. So one thing I should mention about grip techniques and different knife techniques and cuts, what I am doing here is called a chest pull cut. And a lot of people become concerned about cutting towards yourself, but the key to this cut, it's an extremely safe cut, as long as you keep your elbows close to your sides, because you actually lose any momentum towards your body if your elbows are to your sides. If you bring them out, then you have all of this motion that can twist back towards yourself. But as long as your elbows are tight and you're angling the knife back away from yourself, that pull cut actually can't get any closer to your chest. So it's one of those cuts that people do think is quite dangerous. But once you're carving for quite a while, it's one of the safer and one of the more used cuts. Okay, so I've squared off my side profile, or plain view, I think some people call it as well. And now I'm going to start working basically just to bring everything into an even square all the way around. It's pretty close from the axe, but I can bring things in a little bit tighter. And then once things are square, I can start adding a little more dimension to the spoon. And you always want your angles to be as square as they possibly can. Okay, now that I've done the bottom curve, I'll switch over to the top view, and I'll start bringing a little bit more curve into that handle, just so that it sits in the hand nicer. And one really important thing that I should mention is the concept of grain direction. So grain direction, one of the best ways that I've found to describe it is if you imagine a whole bunch of straws sitting lengthways, and that's essentially the sections of grain. Right now, I'm cutting down into some straight sections of grain. And what you want to do is you always want to run downhill with the grain run. You want to basically imagine that you've got this bundle of straws, and when you carve down them, it flattens them all out. If you carve back, it would start to lift them back up. So following that grain direction, that's why when this crank line that I've sawed in is at the lowest point, so you carve back down towards your crank there. On this side, you'll start to rotate to the side just a little bit to make that corner work. And then with the handle, you'll run back down that direction. And it's the opposite on the underside of the spoon, where you'll run back down the handle that way and back down towards the front of the spoon in that direction. Now what I like to do here, this is just a personal preference. You can carve your shoulder joints however you like. I like to create a little stop here, a break in the bowl. Again, it's just a personal preference. It doesn't change things structurally. Just from a design point of view, I like to have the handle run, and then there's a transition between the bowl and the handle for your eye to kind of take a bit of a breath. And what I'm always doing while I'm carving as well, especially with the knife, is I'll start to slowly bring everything in, because this is essentially the working axe lines. And once I start to take it to the knife, I'll start to thin everything up and make everything look a little bit more delicate, a little more refined. Okay, so now that I've got the bulk of the roughing done, we'll switch to the spoon knife for a second. And I use a larger spoon knife called a Timbecon for the roughing work. It's quite a large hook knife. And the way that you position yourself, because the handle is nice and long, I can sit it on my leg. So the same rules apply with grain direction when you're working on the bowl. What you like to do can make your life a little easier if you work from the top around to the base of the crank, the lowest point of the spoon, top around, and then back around that same way. And if you need to, you can cut across the grain, but it does help while you're cutting across the grain to do quite light cuts so that you don't leave a divot in the middle of your spoon. You can think of them as cleaning up the joint or that intersection of grain. Okay, now we'll start refining the shape a little bit more with the straight knife, the Sloyd knife. And this is where you can start to do some finishing cuts if the wood is dry enough, and start to create a little bit more shape to the spoon because it's still quite unrefined. And what I am doing now is I'm getting to a point where I just want to finalize my symmetry on my handle. It still looks a little bit thick, so I'm just going to bring everything down just a little bit. And you can really get lost in finishing cuts as well once you get into these finer details. This is where it becomes very, very meditative. And then the last steps that I like to do, this is still quite green, and so I can get it almost finished. But what will happen is if you have the spoon too thin and completely finished, it will start to dry and the fibers start to tighten up, and then what can happen is it can twist a little bit. So what I do like to do is leave just a little bit of meat, a little bit of bulk on the spoon, just a little bit. Okay, and then I like to just clean up this rim of the bowl because it's not quite finished. And for that I use a smaller hook knife. And then just to finish up, we get smaller and smaller, and we work now on those final edges, just chamfering that edge, softening everything off, because this is an eating spoon, so we want to make sure that the edges aren't sharp. Okay. And it works. There you go.